The purchase alert hits my son's phone at 10:47 a.m. I know because 5 minutes later, his name blooms on my screen like a red siren. By noon, my phone is a hive. By evening, I'm the most popular woman in Connecticut, and all it took was buying my own life without asking permission. If you've ever spent a birthday pretending you didn't notice, no one noticed, you understand the quiet I chose this year. The 15th of March, same date. It's been for 64 consecutive returns around the sun, slid in like a tired guest. I didn't hang streamers on the calendar. I didn't practice earnest reminders on the drive to the grocery store. I didn't send out those "no pressure, just brunch if you're free" texts that are pressure by another name. I smiled when Brian asked, with casual carelessness, "Are you doing anything that weekend?" and said, "Keeping it flexible." I told Sarah when she brought up Patricia's annual spring getaway in Vermont and sighed about poor timing and aging parents. "How nice for you." There's a choreography to being a good mother in New England. You make yourself weather, present, necessary, and conveniently ignorable. You bake, you sit on the sidelines in a coat that matches the team colors, you bring your casserole to the church basement but leave your opinions at the door. You become communal property, not because anyone declares it, but because you stop declaring yourself. I'd been performing that dance for years. This time, I stepped off the floor. The driveway emptied, Brian's car shrinking between bare oaks. Sarah's wave perched on her wrist like a watch she never looks at, and I made a single call. "Jennifer," I said, "find me the most beautiful waterfront property within 50 miles. Money is no object." She laughed like I'd told her a joke in a language she almost understood. "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure?" "I've been thinking for 64 years, I said. "I'm sure." 4 hours later, we stood in a marble foyer that smelled faintly of lemon oil and ocean salt, and I felt my spine say yes. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Long Island Sound like a painting someone forgot to hang. The kitchen gleamed with an easy arrogance, stainless stone. A refrigerator that could store a season of grief and still have room for champagne. The master suite had a fireplace no one needed, and everything I did. Out on the deck, the air was knife-bright and clean, and a gull rode the wind like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had been trying to finish my entire adult life. "It's 3.2, Jennifer said, careful with her consonants, as if numbers might cut me. "I'll take it," I said. A tiny muscle in her cheek jumped. "Don't you want to discuss with your family?" I almost laughed. My family hadn't discussed anything with me since my husband died, only told, advised, guided, managed. I signed what needed signing. The pen felt heavier than it was. You would be amazed how much a woman can lift when no one is looking. By Wednesday, the deed had my name on it in a font that didn't apologize. By Thursday morning, I had remembered enough of my passwords to post photographs. The living room, all light and water. The kitchen island with a solitary cupcake and an insulting amount of champagne. The deck where I ate takeout from the expensive place in town, the kind I'd reserved for anniversaries that disappeared into work trips, and "We'll reschedule, I promise." My caption was small. Birthday celebrations at my new home. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones you give yourself. The shoreline mothers in my feed, women who knew exactly how much you're allowed to want without being called difficult, strong-tapped their hearts. A few private messages arrived like contraband. "Proud of you. Wish I could. Someday." At 10:52 a.m., Brian called. I let it go to voicemail. At 11:15, Sarah tried, then Patricia herself. At 11:43, the mother-in-law promoted by time and habit to matriarch. More calls came, stacked like teacups, wobbling. Texts arrived, dressed as concern, then confusion, then alarm. "Mom Thompson, we're worried this isn't like you. Isn't like me. How would they know what I'm like? They have been dealing with the mother who bends, the widow who shrinks her needs to fit the remaining space, the woman who says, 'Whatever works best for you.' Today, they were going to meet the version of me that remembered her name. I unpacked what mattered. Photo albums that smell like dust in summer. My grandmother's blue and white china with its hairline cracks like lifelines on a palm. The quilt my mother made for my wedding. Its corners softened by 30 years of laundry and compromise. I built a small shrine to the women who raised me, people who believed in thrift and loyalty, and keeping your voice gentle in public, and asked their faces for permission to be a little selfish. They looked back with the expression women wear when they pretend they don't mind being hungry. 23 missed calls by dinner time. I turned the sound off and let the phone throb on the counter like a fish that refused to die. As the sun took its slow gold scissors to the water, I poured wine from my brand new wine fridge, something my son would declare a foolish extravagance, and toasted Aunt Helen in Boston, who taught me that foolishness is sometimes another word for freedom. It was 5 years ago, in a grocery store parking lot, that I learned how invisible I'd become. The day after my birthday, I watched my son and his wife and Patricia raise flutes at the new bistro downtown while I waited in my car for rotisserie chicken and an excuse to feel grateful. Patricia, who'd been tragically indisposed the day before, looked miraculously hearty. They laughed like relief. I cried quietly, face turned toward the driver's window, the one where strangers can't see you. Then I drank my tears like a strong woman does, swift swallow, no sound. I went home and cut the cake I'd bought for myself and told the dog we were lucky. The emergencies multiplied in the years that followed: vertigo, anxiety, falls without bruises, specialists who required travel exactly when my calendar asked to be seen. You don't accuse a woman your son calls mom of making things up. You simply become reasonable. And reason, in families, is the polite word for erasure. At church, women in tasteful sweaters talked about age-appropriate transitions and supportive communities. In Brian and Sarah's kitchen white subway tile, stiff bar stools that discourage lingering, my contributions were tidied into, "Don't worry about that, Mom, we've got it." When my husband died, Brian became a joint account holder for emergencies. Later, he added transaction alerts to my phone, so nothing slips through. It was love, yes, the kind that fences you for your own protection. So this year, I chose silence. Silence is a strategy if you light it properly. I didn't hint about an afternoon free. I didn't resend last year's restaurant link. I didn't perform the comedy of the grateful mother who says, "Oh, you remembered," to a text. I let the day approach like a tide, and when their car turned up the Vermont road, I took my own keys. That night on the new deck, the water spoke a language that doesn't need translating. Come back, come home, come as you are. The wind lifted the edge of the paper bag, the takeout came in and made it flutter like a small, frantic bird. Across the sound, lights stitched a loose hem on the horizon. I ate slowly. For decades, I had eaten fast or after, or not at all. Mothers learned to taste last, widows learned to go without. I put my feet up on furniture that had never been forced to host a family gathering I wasn't invited to, and I chewed like someone was watching me with approval. The messages turned sharp by late afternoon. Concern calcified into command. Call me back now. We need to talk about this before you do anything else. Mom, you can't make decisions of this magnitude alone. There it was, in plain text. The idea that my life is a group project and I am the least reliable partner. I watched a sailboat ghost pass the glass, its sail briefly stitching sunlight to water, and felt a heat rise under my ribs that wasn't anger so much as oxygen finally granted permission. I posted one more photo, not the view or the kitchen. A corner of the hallway where I'd hung my mother's quilt beside a modern painting Helen once bought at a student show for $40. Old stitches beside new strokes. Women's work turned into art, then into inheritance. Beginning again, I wrote. A few friends sent hearts. One wrote, privately, "Teach me how." The phone rang again, Brian. 4th time this hour. My thumb hovered, then pressed. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, and my voice surprised me by sounding steady. "Mom, thank God." "Where are you?" Jennifer called. "She said you bought a house, a $3.2 million house." I looked past my reflection to the water, where the last light lay down, and went quiet. "I did," I said. "It's lovely. Are you feeling all right? This is very unlike you." There it was again, the cage built from kindness. "I'm feeling wonderful," I said. "The best I've felt in years. How's Patricia's birthday?" Silence. Then, careful. "Fine. But we need to talk about this purchase. This is a major financial decision. You should have consulted us." Consulted us. As if my name had become plural without my consent. I stood, cradling the phone against my shoulder, and let the night air meet my face. The truth settled on my tongue like a sacrament I had finally earned. "Brian," I said, "I'll explain. But start from the assumption that I know what I'm doing." His breath snagged. "Mom, you can't afford." I watched the water take back the light it had borrowed and realized I didn't have to finish his sentence for him anymore. "We'll talk tomorrow," I said gently. "Tonight is mine." I ended the call and let the quiet fill the house. Not like an absence, but like a room I had finally opened. Somewhere in town, the new bistro's dishwasher hummed, and the parking lot collected the day's dropped promises. Here, in the house with my name on it, the ocean kept its patient score. I poured more wine and practiced saying my own, out loud, until it sounded like a place I could live. Aunt Helen's inheritance had sat in my account for 6 months before I told anyone she was gone. The money was not the secret Helen herself was. To my family, she had been a shadow at weddings, a name scrawled on Christmas cards they signed with mechanical cheer. To me, she was the only adult who had ever looked me square in the eye and said, "You're more than what they expect of you." Helen had been scandalous once choosing career over marriage when such choices branded women as half-formed. She climbed from secretary to vice president at a Boston insurance company, bought her brownstone when Back Bay was still affordable, and lived among her art and her books with a clarity that frightened people who measured their worth by husbands and children. She wasn't rich, not obviously. She wore the same camel coat for decades, scuffed at the sleeves, but she traveled Barcelona in the spring, Kyoto in the fall, and sent postcards with handwriting sharp as her wit. I visited her every other month. We walked through the public garden, where swan boats skimmed the water. We ate at restaurants where the waiters remembered her martini order. She would tilt her head at me across the table and say, "They underestimate you because it makes their lives easier. Don't help them." When cancer came, she faced it with the same brisk competence she brought to quarterly reports. I sat beside her in chemo wards that smelled of disinfectant and lost battles. I held her hand the morning she died in September, while my son and his wife sent flowers from Napa because flights were impossible to rearrange. After the funeral, her lawyer, Marcus Reed, handed me a sealed envelope, Helen's handwriting on the front. For Margaret only. Inside, a letter. "Dearest Margaret, stop crying. I lived exactly the life I wanted. Now it's your turn. I've left you everything not because you are my only niece, but because you are the only one who ever treated me as a person. Your son loves you, but he has been taught to see you as fragile. They will try to manage you out of your own life. Don't let them. You are stronger than you've allowed yourself to be. Use this money to remember who you were before you were anyone else's responsibility. Live boldly." I sat in Marcus's office while he recited the numbers: brownstone appraised at $1.8 million, portfolio grown to $4.2, art collection valued at $1.3. After taxes and fees, $7.3 million sat waiting for me to decide who I was. $7 million. Enough to silence Brian's warnings about fixed income. Enough to stop pretending I was fragile. Enough to remind me that invisibility was a choice, not a destiny. I said nothing for months. Let Brian switch my phone to a simpler plan, as if I hadn't managed 2 businesses' schedules before smartphones existed. Let Sarah roll her eyes when I mentioned travel, as though older women didn't belong on planes unless they were grandmothers with Disneyland tickets. Let them place me gently on the shelf beside framed photographs, a family heirloom polished but unused. And all the while, I planned. I pictured Helen at my side when I first stepped into the villa foyer, the marble floor reflecting light, the air thick with the salt of Long Island Sound. She would have smirked and said, "Finally." I felt her laughter when Jennifer asked if I wanted to discuss it with my family. When was the last time they discussed anything with you? So when I posted those photos of the living room bathed in ocean, the cupcake on the island, the deck with its champagne glass glinting like a dare, it wasn't just a celebration, it was a resurrection. The phone buzzed with their panic, but I let it ring. I unpacked Helen's crystal vase and filled it with supermarket tulips. I placed the quilt my mother had stitched on a chair near the window. I poured wine from the fridge that hummed softly, as if pleased to serve me alone. For years, I had been someone's mother, someone's widow, someone's responsibility. Now I was Helen's heir, my own woman again. And for the first time in decades, the house around me felt like it echoed my name. Saturday morning brought the sound of tires on gravel. Brian stood at my villa's glass door, eyes ringed with sleepless panic, his shirt creased from driving through the night. He didn't say hello. "We need to talk." I smiled as if we were still mother and son, not plaintiff and accuser. "Coffee first," I said. The new machine whirred, polished steel gleaming. He looked at it like evidence. "Mom, this is insane," he began. "You can't just buy a $3.2 million house without discussing it." "I was thinking," I said evenly, measuring grounds with deliberate care, "that I'm a grown woman with my own money. Would you like cream?" His face flushed. "Don't be flippant. The property taxes alone." $32,000 a year, I answered, sliding the mug across marble. "Already budgeted." He stared. "Dad's life insurance was $400,000, even with your savings." And there it was, the assumption that I was living on scraps and Social Security, that I was manageable, that my role was to be grateful. I leaned forward, my hand on the warm porcelain. "Brian, when was the last time you actually looked at my accounts? Not your alerts, not the withdrawals looked." He fumbled. "I check for unusual activity. To protect you." "To protect me?" I laughed softly, but it cut. "Or to protect the version of me you've decided on?" Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of waves striking the shore like a metronome. He sipped, then finally whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," I said, "I wanted to see how you would react when I made a decision on my own." His eyes flicked around the room at the tall windows, at my mother's quilt on the chair, at the tulips reaching toward sunlight as if called by name. He looked, for once, not like a financial advisor but like my boy, struggling to read a language he never learned, his mother's independence. By Sunday, the chorus had swelled. Linda, my sister, phoned from Florida. "Maggie, are you having some kind of crisis? Brian is worried sick. Sarah says you've lost touch with reality." "I'm 64, I replied. "If this is a midlife crisis, I intend to live to 128. Linda sked. "It's not funny. You're isolating yourself, spending recklessly, refusing to consider future care." Future care. As if I were tottering toward assisted living instead of sipping wine on my own deck, healthier than most people my age. "Did you ask permission when you and Robert bought your condo in Sarasota?" I asked. "That's different." "Yes," I said. "You had to consult your husband. I consulted myself. Same process." Click, call over. The second was Michael, her son. His voice was cautious, filial. "Aunt Maggie, Mom asked me to check. Are you okay?" "I'm fantastic," I said. "It just doesn't seem like you. You're practical, careful. You don't make impulsive choices." I looked out at the sound, sunlight skating across water like coins tossed in a fountain. "Michael, I've been considering a place like this for 2 years. The only impulse was deciding to stop waiting for permission." He hesitated. "Why now?" "Because," I said, "I was tired of spending birthdays alone. Because I realized if I waited for approval, I'd die waiting." The third call came from Sarah, with Patricia's breath audible in the background. Sarah's tone was silk covering steel. "Mom Thompson, we're concerned. Patricia thinks this purchase may signal cognitive decline." Patricia thinks. Patricia always thinks, and Sarah always repeats. "What do you think, Sarah?" I asked. A pause. Then, cautious. "I think you're acting unlike yourself." "Or perhaps," I said, "you've never seen myself." The silence that followed was thicker than accusation. On Monday, they arrived in person. Sarah at the wheel, Patricia beside her with a folder fat enough to slap down on a table. They swept into my marble foyer like regulators on inspection. Patricia sniffed. "Well, it certainly is. Large." I poured coffee. They didn't smile. At the kitchen island, Patricia opened her folder with the gravitas of a judge. "Margaret, we need to discuss what's really going on. This purchase reflects concerning patterns, impulsivity, secrecy, withdrawal from family." Sarah chimed in, rehearsed. "It seems more about proving something than about your housing needs." I laughed, low and even. "What exactly do you think I'm proving?" Patricia leaned forward, her perfume sharp. "That you don't need family input, that you're still capable." That you're not ready for the kind of guided living that would be more appropriate. Guided living? I almost choked. Is that what we're calling assisted living now? Sarah flipped open a brochure. Glossy pages of smiling, silver-haired couples doing gentle yoga. Active adult communities, she corrected. Excellent amenities, built-in healthcare. Sunnybrook Senior Living, Golden Years Community, Heritage Oaks, places where people go when they've been gently erased. I laid the brochure flat on the counter and tapped it once with my finger. Let me save you the trouble. I'm not moving into a senior community. I'm not surrendering my finances for supervision, and I'm not mistaking your discomfort for my welfare. Patricia's mask cracked. Your independence is selfish. Families need reliability. You're acting like a rebellious teenager. I almost laughed at the thought of myself widowed, 64 gray-streaked hair cast as a teenager. Patricia, I bought a house with my own money. How does that harm your reliability? Neither of them answered. The brochures wilted in the silence. When they finally left, I stood in the doorway and let the salt air wash the house clean of their perfume. My mother's quilt glowed in late light, Helen's vase of tulips bending toward evening. For the first time, the walls seemed to breathe with me. I understood now. What they feared wasn't my recklessness. It was my refusal to be small. The discovery began not with suspicion, but with dust. I had finally decided to clean out the old desk in the corner of my former home, the one that still smelled faintly of my husband's pipe tobacco, even though the pipe had been buried with him years before. Inside a drawer, hidden behind warranty papers for appliances that hadn't worked since the Bush administration, I found a manila folder. On the tab, in my late husband's careful block letters, Brian, private. My heart stuttered. I opened it. Inside were loan applications, bank statements, letters from credit card companies, figures scrawled in a hand I recognized my son's beside, balances that made my stomach flip. $47,000 in credit card debt, a mortgage 3 months behind, and most sickening of all, documents for a second mortgage on Brian's house with my name as co-signer. My signature, forged, just 2 months after his father's funeral. The paper trembled in my hand. My son, my responsible boy, the one who used to count pennies in his piggy bank and balance allowance against baseball cards, had turned into someone I didn't know. But the dates, that was the knife twist. Every financial collapse lined up perfectly with one of Patricia's emergencies. Her broken hip, her vertigo, her cardiac scare. All those convenient tragedies that had stolen my birthdays had also hidden Brian's crises. I sat in the old leather chair and felt a coldness settle in my bones. My son wasn't just inattentive, he was drowning, and he had dragged my name down with him. I called Marcus, Aunt Helen's lawyer. My voice shook, but his response was calm, practiced. Margaret, we'll need to run a credit check in your name. 3 hours later, he called back. I'm afraid your suspicions are correct. 2 credit cards, a personal loan, your social security number used without permission. Your score has dropped from excellent to precarious. I pressed the phone to my ear and stared out at the sound, where the water, so calm and bright, made the truth feel even darker. That evening, Sarah arrived. She stood on my new porch, clutching a gift bag, a Vermont snow globe inside, a peace offering. Patricia had felt bad, Sarah explained, for how the conversation had gone. I let her in. We sat in the living room, where the air felt heavy with things unsaid. Mom Thompson, Sarah began carefully. We may have overreacted. It's just Brian's been under so much stress lately, and when you bought this place without telling him, he unraveled a little. Stressed about what? I asked. Her smile faltered. Work, money, you know how he worries. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her perfect hair, her measured tone, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if cataloging it. How long have you known about Brian's financial problems? I asked. She blinked. What problems? The credit card debt, the loans, the forged signatures, the accounts in my name. Her face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about. But her voice betrayed her. She knew. He didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered finally. It started small, just 1 card. Then Patricia really did get sick, and the bills. What bills? I snapped. She has insurance. Sarah hesitated, twisting her wedding ring. Not for the specialists, the experimental treatments. Patricia has connections. She was an office manager at an insurance firm, I said, my voice hard. The only connections she has are to her own lies. Sarah stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. That's not true. She's been like a mother to me. She cares about this family. No, I said coldly. She's been draining this family, and Brian has been helping her. She backed toward the door, muttering something about stress and misunderstandings. The snow globe sat forgotten on my entry table, the little Vermont inn trapped forever in swirling glitter. That night, after Sarah fled, I opened my laptop and logged into social media, hers, Patricia's, anyone connected to them. I scrolled through years of curated smiles. On Sarah's Instagram, there were happy family photos, but oddly, none from the early months of her relationship with Brian. Their history seemed to begin already established, like a story missing its first chapter. Then, Patricia's Facebook. Her profile claimed Vermont roots, but her tags told the truth. Florida, North Carolina, Georgia. Always photos with different families. Always smiling at Christmas tables, at graduation parties, at barbecues. Always Grandma Pat in the comments. In one album from Florida, she wore the same necklace she'd worn to Brian and Sarah's wedding. The pattern was unmistakable. Patricia embedded herself like ivy into families, choking them gently until they were dry. Then she moved on. But Sarah, that was what gnawed at me. Was she another victim, or had she been ivy too, twining beside Patricia from the start? At 11:30 p.m., my security system pinged. Movement in the driveway. I crept to the window, Sarah's car, headlights off. She sat for minutes, talking on the phone. Then she walked toward my deck, testing the sliding door. When it didn't open, she made another call, gesturing sharply with her free hand. After 10 minutes, she left, the taillights disappearing into the dark. My hands shook as I dialed Marcus again. Run a background check on Sarah Mitchell, I said, using her maiden name. May I ask why? Because, I whispered, watching the snow globe sparkle dully in the dark, I think she might not be who she says she is. Brian called me the next morning, his voice ragged as though he'd aged a decade overnight. Mom, I need to see you. Please, come alone. When I arrived at his house, he was waiting at the door, eyes hollow, a manila folder clutched like contraband. He led me inside without a word and spread the papers across the kitchen table. Bank account statements I'd never seen, credit reports with my name scrawled in places I never signed, photographs of our family documents, insurance papers, investment files, even snapshots of me at gatherings with little notes scribbled in Sarah's handwriting, trusting, compliant, vulnerable. And then, at the bottom, a letter. Mom, the Thompson situation is going better than expected. Brian trusts me completely. His mother has more assets than we thought. If we move quickly, we can secure the inheritance before she catches on. Sarah. Brian read it aloud with shaking hands. When he finished, his voice cracked. She never loved me, not once. I touched his arm. You believed in love. That's not stupidity. That's being human. His body crumpled into the chair, shoulders heaving. What do we do? Now, I said, my jaw tightening. We fight back. That afternoon, I sat in my villa's sunlit living room with Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit. She listened quietly as Marcus, my lawyer, laid out the evidence. The forged loans, the offshore transfer attempt, the letter. When he finished, Rodriguez leaned back. This isn't petty fraud. It's an operation. Likely interstate, maybe international. Patricia and your daughter-in-law have done this before. Then let's stop them, I said. We agreed to set a trap. I would wear a wire during Patricia's next call. The bank had already flagged their attempt to move $2.3 million from my investments. Rodriguez would prepare 3 potential pickup points, each under surveillance. All I had to do was play my part. But before the performance, there was a confession to make, one heavier than any fraud. That evening, I asked Brian to sit with me on the deck. The water was calm, the sound flat as glass, the air heavy with truth I'd postponed for years. Brian, I began, there are things about your father you don't know. He frowned, wary. Your father, he wasn't always the man you thought. He built wealth through shell companies, tax evasion, partnerships that weren't entirely legal. I discovered it 2 years before he died. He tried to fix it, to launder legitimacy through investments and donations, but my voice faltered. He left us with shadows, Brian. That's why his estate was larger than you realized. Brian's face drained of color. Are you saying Dad was a criminal? I'm saying he was desperate, afraid, human. But yes, he crossed lines. I reached for his hand, and I helped cover it, in silence. I thought I was protecting you. Instead, I taught you to keep secrets. He looked away, tears bright. Are we going to prison? I don't know, I whispered. But I will not give Patricia a dime to keep those secrets buried. If there are consequences, we'll face them honestly. Together. The following evening, Patricia called. Her voice slid through the line, smooth as oil. Margaret, have you thought about our arrangement? I have, I said, steady despite the wire humming beneath my blouse. And? Number. Silence. Then a low laugh. You don't understand. I can destroy your family, your husband's tax evasion, Brian's forged signatures. The papers I have would ruin you. Then do it, I said, because I will not be blackmailed one more day. You mistook my silence for weakness, Patricia, but I'd rather burn with truth than live muzzled by your lies. There was a pause, colder than winter. You'll regret this. Maybe, I replied, but it will be my regret, not yours to rent. I hung up. Minutes later, Rodriguez emerged from the side room, her recorder blinking red. We got it, she said. By dawn, Patricia had already made her move. Anonymous packages landed on the doorstep of the local paper and the IRS. My husband's old sins spilled into daylight. The damage was swift and merciless. $1.8 million in back taxes and penalties, lawyers circling, my name whispered in town like a curse. Brian faced questioning about his father's documents, his innocence hanging by threads. But something unexpected happened in the fire. Brian and I sat across from each other, stripped of illusions. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered one night, eyes red, for the loans, the control, treating you like a child. And I'm sorry, I said, for teaching you to carry silence, for letting you think love means management. For the first time in years, we were not protector and protected, not parent and burden. Just two people, rebuilding from ruins. 3 months later, the sound was warmer, the gulls noisier, and my villa no longer felt like an act of defiance. It felt like home. The investigation had stretched across states, stitching together a quilt of Patricia's aliases and Sarah's lies. Detective Rodriguez called one humid afternoon with the news. We found them, she said. Mexico. They'd latched onto a wealthy family in Guadalajara, running the same con. The local police picked them up. Extradition is in process. What charges? I asked, though my heart already knew the answer would be heavy. Wire fraud, identity theft, extortion, conspiracy. If convicted, they'll be gone for a long time. I thanked her, then sat on my deck with a glass of wine, staring at the line where water met sky. Justice had arrived, not as vengeance, but as inevitability. The money would not all come back. Of the $180,000 Brian had funneled into Patricia's abyss, only about $400,000 was recovered across various accounts. But money was never the sharpest wound, it was trust. Brian's trust in Sarah, my trust in my son's judgment, even the fragile trust I'd placed in silence to protect me. The courts untangled the marriage quickly. Sarah couldn't contest from prison. Their divorce papers carried none of the theatrics of a love story's end, just signatures, inked with weary hands. Brian sold the house that held ghosts and debts, choosing a smaller place near my villa. Close enough for coffee, but not too close for oxygen, he joked, his smile tentative but real. As for me, I kept the villa, not because I needed every room, but because it stood for something larger than square footage. It was the place where I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. The marble floors and sweeping windows didn't just display wealth, they displayed choice, my choice. I began to build a life not around their expectations, but around my own breath. I signed up for an art class in town, paint staining my fingers in colors I hadn't touched since college. I took weekend trips to Boston and walked the old routes Helen and I had loved. this time without the shadow of secrecy. I planned a European tour, the one I had whispered about for decades and always postponed for better timing. And every week, Brian came by. Sometimes twice. We sat on my deck with coffee in the morning, or wine at sunset, and for the first time in years, our conversations weren't about obligations or monitoring or crisis management. They were about us, what we wanted, what we feared, who we were when no one else was scripting us. One evening, as gulls circled overhead and the horizon blushed pink, Brian said quietly, "You know, I think you saved me." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, sweetheart, we saved each other. You by confessing, me by finally speaking." What Patricia and Sarah taught me wasn't about fraud or schemes, though those lessons burned deep. They taught me something sharper, that kindness can be mistaken for weakness, that love can be weaponized into silence, and that the people closest to us can sometimes see us not as humans but as resources. But dignity is not something anyone can give you. It's something you claim, not by being loud, but by refusing to vanish, by saying, "I exist, I matter. My choices are my own." I'm 65 now. Some mornings, I still wake up startled by the ocean view, the glassy horizon like a promise that time can stretch forward instead of only folding backward. Other mornings, I simply wake up grateful that the house around me hums with my name instead of someone else's schedule. The villa purchase was never just about the house. It was about standing in the center of my own story, about claiming space in a family that had trained me to shrink, about remembering that Margaret Thompson is not just someone's mother, someone's widow, someone's afterthought. She is a woman, still here, still wanting, still capable of beginning again. And that, I've learned, is the best revenge, not getting even, but refusing to stay small.